This episode of 1v1, the Creator Interview Series, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support this show and the Boss Rush Media family of podcasts, head over to patreon.com/bossrushmedia or search for us on the Patreon app on your smart device. Thanks for helping us build something better.
Hello everybody, welcome to 1v1 here on Boss Rush Games. I'm your host, the Enlightened Excited Eddie V. Joining me, this special guest, I'm so happy to have one part of a four-man crew, I gotta say. Hopefully then I'm getting that right.
We got 7 people. We got 7 people. We got a pretty large crew of people over at the Carpool. But continue the introduction.
Well, everybody, he is one of the hosts of the Xbox Drive. He's a retro game collector himself. He's part of the RPG Cave, the Pit Stop Retro Gaming Crew. I am going to ask him this question in advance. But I wonder, are you one of the founders of Carpool Gaming, or did you join a little bit later on before I dropped your big name?
Yeah. I'm not. So it's a bit tricky because Carpool Gaming actually hasn't been Carpool Gaming forever. We used to be called Yumi Capri, and it was actually founded by Sean Capri and Bobby Pauls back in the day.
Okay.
And then Bobby and Sean brought me into the fold in 2019 when I started co-hosting the Xbox Drive. So then it became kind of us three. But then unfortunately Bobby passed away during COVID. So it was just Sean and I, and we were the ones that took on a rebranding of Yumi Capri to kind of be a new thing. And then eventually it was him and I that came up with the idea for Carpool Gaming. So that's when we started bringing in Consul Cato, Garrett Bland, Matt Sawinski, Court Lalonde, and that's how we kind of got to where we are now. So in a way, yes, I'm technically one of the founders of Carpool Gaming specifically, but not of the whole vision goes back even farther than that.
Further back. Yes, everybody, please welcome the one, the only Ryan Turford. Hello, good sir.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to talk about all things gaming and whatnot today. And I'm excited. I don't get to be guest on that many podcasts very often because of my crazy work schedule. So I am happy to be on another show this week. It's gonna be fun.
Yes, and you are in Canada. Okay, see, I'm seeing all the Super Nintendo games, and I'm about to pass out.
Of course. I mean, I've got a copy of American Gladiators on SNES sitting right there front and center.
No, you do not!
Yeah, I partially did that on purpose because it's usually up there on top of the other games, but I did that episode of Pit Stop Retro Gaming recently because we just launched that show over at Carpool, which is our retro gaming show, and one of the episodes was on American Gladiators video games. So, of course, I did display it front and center now in the shots for any of the video podcasts that we do.
Oh, that is awesome. Yes, everybody. Kind of in a way, I was telling the guys at Carpool Gaming, I'm just like, I kind of feel like it's going to be a month dedicated to at least for you guys, to you all, because you do such amazing work. I literally been watching your shows, and been listening to them and everything, and I'm just so excited for where you guys are going and the things that you are do. The PlayStation Drive, Matt and Court, they do answer my wacky questions a lot. Because I asked Court and I asked Matt, I asked them if Sony was to bring Lair back for PSVR 2, do you think they would get that game right, and do you think people would buy it and everything? Because Lair was a mess when it came out.
Yeah, I think you would just make people seasick from flying around on your dragon, more than anything. But I mean, maybe they could nail it, but probably not. Because yeah, you're right. That game was a mess with because it was 6 axis only controls at the
Yes.
start. They did eventually patch it, so you could play with just normal controls. A
Uh-huh.
year or two after it came out, but it was too late at that point because you couldn't really, no one wanted to go back to a game 2 years afterwards that just wasn't all, it already wasn't a great game to begin with, combined with the fact that a year or two later no one was really wanting to bust that out, which is too bad because Factor 5, an amazing developer. I love the Star Wars Rogue Squadron games, and the fact that
Yes.
the layer kind of killed them just makes me sad every time I think about it.
I miss them so much. Factor 5 was one of the great developers of their time that came in. I mean, they were just phenomenal. Um, but before we continue on, Ryan, I have to ask you, how did you actually get into gaming? And everybody, to let you know, he's from Canada.
Yes,
So
exactly. Well, actually, like the nice thing about Carpool is like half of us are Canadian, half of us are Americans. We have like a nice even split across North America, which is kind of nice. So, yes, so I actually got into gaming pretty young. Actually, my parents both are big dorks, so they're into watching sci-fi movies, and they
mhm,
were into playing video games for a little while. That my mom and dad don't really play video games now, but they did in their younger years. So, I the first time I played a game, I was 3, which normally nowadays doesn't seem like a crazy thing, but back in
exactly.
19 but back in the 80s, that didn't happen very often because most parents probably weren't playing games with their kids at that time. So actually one of my earliest gaming memories was every Friday night we would bust out the our Coleco Gemini. And for folks that don't know what the Coleco Gemini is, it's an Atari clone console created by Coleco, where you basically would put in Atari. It played Atari 2600 cartridges, despite the fact that it wasn't made by Atari, because back
Exactly.
then there were no rules about that kind of thing. Like they actually had an adapter for the ColecoVision, as an example, where you plugged it into your ColecoVision and it
Uh,
played Atari 2600 games. So that's the equivalent today of Sony having a special disk drive attachment for the PlayStation 5 that you put Xbox Series X games in and play them. Like
oh wow.
that's how crazy of a time it was back then. So yeah, so we played that every Friday night, and we have 4 games for our Coleco Gemini, including Donkey Kong for Atari 2600, like the original arcade Donkey Kong, Mousetrap, Star Wars, Duelist Academy, which was like this game where you basically play as a lightsaber. You just scroll back and forth, almost like a windshield
Uh,
wiper, and it's kind of meant to be like it's trying to represent like that drone scene from the original Star Wars where Luke has the helmet over his head and
yeah,
he's trying to
yeah.
deflect the bolts. Like it's basically that, but in video game form. And then we also had Return of the Jedi, the arcade game. So I got my start on Atari 2600 in 1986 is when I first started playing
Oh
video
wow.
games. But after that, what really got me into it, because that was just a casual thing we did. My parents made a mistake of buying us, me and my older brother Kyle. We're very close in age, so it just makes sense for this to kind of be. We got a lot of shared birthday presents, and one of them was for my birthday. They got both of us the NES Power Pack with Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt.
Yeah.
And it even though it was a present for both of us, I basically just kind of took over. And as soon as I played Mario Brothers for the first time, it was kind of over for me, non video game playing Ryan at that point, because I was kind of all in at that point. Like I would play like I would just come home and spend hours and hours and hours playing Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt as well, which I spent so much time playing as well.
I I remember actually going through all 32 levels of Super Mario Brothers. Uh
Nice.
and I didn't do that until 1992
Okay.
in a sense. And I was just like, you know what? I've never seen every level of this game. I always did the warp pipe thing
Yeah.
and all the secrets. I'm like, I always wonder how the challenge. I did that, and I did that for Sonic 1 and Sonic 2. That
Okay.
I would actually go through everything, try to definitely for Sonic get all the Chaos Emeralds, and then see how the game is actually beating. Just be like, I wonder how this game is if this game is actually challenging or not.
Yeah, well, not only that too, with Sonic 1 and 2, you know, you don't even get the good ending in quotations of the
Hmm.
story unless you get all of the Chaos Emeralds. Or in, you know, in Sonic CD's case, for example, you have to then, you know, fix the future for a bunch of different places and get all the time emeralds on top of that in order to get the fancy ending. But actually, so then I thought of something when you're talking about seeing all the levels in the original Super Mario Brothers. That
Yes.
means, of course, that if you saw the levels, that means that you went to the negative level, where it just loops the underwater level
Hmm.
over and over and over again
Yep.
until you feel like you just need to reset the console at that point.
Yep. Did all of that. I was I really was dedicated to games. Definitely, with the NES and my older brother, he had the Sega Master System and I had the Nintendo. So the games that he would play with me would be like Contra or Tecmo Bowl or Punch Out and stuff. And then with him I would play Joe Montana football, or I would play like Rocky and stuff like that. I also got to play like Pat Riley basketball and stuff
Of
on the
course.
Sega Genesis. So, but it was kind of our household that way when it came into gaming. The thing is that I think I got too much into it, and which leads to the next question: did you read video game magazines? And
I
what popular ones were in your time of growing up?
So I actually had a subscription. So actually, we had dual subscriptions in our household because my brother Kyle, he had a subscription to GamePro, and I got the subscription to Nintendo
Ah,
Power. So we actually had
nice.
both, and we would just read both magazines literally every month. Because yeah, my mom could definitely tell like we were both pretty into video games. Definitely me, probably more than Kyle, but definitely both of us were definitely into video games. So you know, whenever we got a birthday gift or a Christmas gift, it was usually video game related. And one year they decided
Mm,
for Christmas that they gave us, instead of giving us games, they gave us a subscription to the magazine that kept going for 2 years for GamePro and Nintendo Power. So yeah, I used to have all those, but unfortunately, I've moved so many times since then. I haven't really been able to keep all those magazines, unfortunately. But yes, those were the two that were really those were probably the two most popular magazines when I during my time when I was growing up, and those were of course the ones that I read at the time. I mean, EGM was around and kind of just starting
that's
out, but it just wasn't as popular at the time when I was really, you know, reading a ton of magazines.
uh
And then, of course, you know, I did go back and start reading magazines in the early 2000s as I was getting back into console gaming because I had a phase where I only played PC games for the longest time. So,
really.
um, yeah, which is just weird to think about when I think about myself today, where I pretty much only play games on consoles at this point. So, yeah, that when I was getting back into console games, I was actually reading magazines again. So I was reading OXM and reading EGM at that time in kind of the early 2000s to kind of get reacquainted with console games.
EGM was my Bible when it came to video games. Like I remember the Mega Man 2 cover. I remember having the Legend of Zelda. I think it was Link to the Past. It had a different, but it had like an anime cover to it. Like EGM
Mhm.
was my Bible, way back in the day. I did do Game Pro and then did like EGM 2 and stuff like that. Um, I did some Game Informer. I haven't did Game Informer now because my GameStop. There's barely any GameStops in my area, and
Yeah,
so I would have to drive out like half an hour just to subscribe. I'm just like I pretty much now buy my games new, or I get them like digitally or something.
yeah.
They're normally just like a sale.
Well, also too, it's like just the way information is dispersed has really changed, you know, since we were
Hmm.
kids, or since the early 2000s, where you know there were video game websites in the early 2000s, but you know there weren't a ton of them, and you didn't really know how reliable they were. So I actually felt like magazines might have been the better route at that time. But nowadays, it's just like I mean, there are like Sean Capri's out here still getting PC Gamer, but I don't know how many other people are still reading magazines nowadays, because I feel like it's kind of a lost art in a way, where you know a lot of that information's online, and you can get articles and things like that, not just reviews, but also previews, or you know, you get other think pieces as well, or you get a lot of that in the YouTube space. So a lot of that
Yeah.
information that you normally get from magazines is just available for free on the internet. So you don't really need to go and buy a magazine. And it's kind of available whenever you want it versus, waiting for that Nintendo Power to come out with the map for Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest so I can get through that game, because that game is very complicated and it's hard to do without a map.
I beat Castlevania 2 Simon Quest, which I tell everybody, I'm like, Symphony of the Night wasn't the first Metroidvania from the
Yep.
Castlevania games. It was Simon Quest 2, but a lot of people don't know that. And I remember, speaking of like Game Informer and everything, I remember getting Game Informer when they did Street Fighter 2, the World Warriors, and they was doing the arcade version, and they was showing all the screens of high punch, mid punch, low punch, and all the kicks and stuff. And I remember studying that book and then realizing this makes nothing to me because I haven't played the game. I didn't learn Street Fighter 2 until it came out on the Super Nintendo, and then I
Yeah.
looked at the Game Pro book and I'm like, okay, now I get it.
Yeah, actually I used to do that a lot with games that would appear in Nintendo Power, like Link's Awakening, for example. I never actually
Mhm.
had that game as a kid, but I read all about Link's Awakening in Nintendo Power, like studied the map and stuff like that. I'm like, all right, I'll be ready to go if I ever got this game. Never got Link's Awakening, of course, growing up or anything like that. Because actually, believe it or not, I'm one of those kids that even though I had a Game Boy, I was actually more focused on growing my Game Gear collection instead, because I had the Sega Game Gear as
Really?
well. Yes, but I'm also one of the weird cases as well, that because you don't see this that often, where I had a Super Nintendo and a Sega Genesis growing up,
Yeah.
because basically the Super Nintendo was Kyle's and the Sega Genesis was mine. And because of a bunch of different circumstances, I ended up actually being a Sega kid over a Nintendo kid, despite the fact that I had a Super Nintendo and a lot of fantastic games for it. Because part of it came down to I just did a video last month about the Sega Channel, which was basically
Hmm.
this subscription service that you subscribe to through your cable company, and it was kind of
Yeah.
like Game Pass, where you downloaded games to your Sega
Yeah.
console and you played them. So I got exposed to
Yes.
so many more games on Genesis than I ever did on Super Nintendo because of that. Combined with the fact that we also had Sega CD, which playing a game like Lunar the Silver Star in 1992 with
Working design.
CD quality music and like full cutscenes and stuff like that, like that stuff blew my mind back then. That just no other consoles were really
I
doing back then.
I had a chance to buy Snatcher on Sega CD for
Oh,
$20 at KB Toy Store, but I didn't. I actually ended up getting Rama half on Super Nintendo because I didn't have a Sega CD.
oh my god. That's
We.
it's so sad to think about, but I know there's been so many opportunities for me too, like that, where it's like there
Mhm.
are so many Sega CD games I could have gotten back then. Because like for example, like for Kyle's birthday, we ended up going to Toys R Us. And they're like, all right, pick out a game, and that's what we'll get you for your birthday. And he picked out Jurassic Park on Sega CD, which is a terrible game. It's like a point and click adventure game.
Mhm. Yeah.
Luckily for us, when we got the game home, the game was defective and it didn't work. So we actually ended up returning it, and we returned it for Lunar on Sega CD, which now is like a $300 game. If you actually
Mhm.
want a physical copy of it, but there are so many circumstances like that where I used to see at my Toys R Us Snatcher on the shelf, or other games like that, like more expensive games like Kyo Flying Squadron or Popful Mail. Like we saw
Yeah.
games like that all the time at normal prices, and now some of those games, like Popful Mail, for example, is $1,000 game if you want to go buy it. Like it's around the same price as Stature at this point, which is why like I don't make the same mistake again. Like when the PlayStation TV, most recent example being the PlayStation TV, when those were on liquid clearance at Best Buy here in Canada.
Uh,
I saw one in the bargain bin for $10, and managed to pick one of those up. The PlayStation TV, for folks that are listening who don't know, is a PlayStation Vita that is in this very tiny, compact, shape that you then connect to your TV and you play PlayStation Vita games on your TV. Now those PlayStation TV units are more expensive than the Vita itself goes for now. They're like $500 to $600 now because they were so rare. Um, but they also didn't sell any, which is why like there are so few of them that came to North America. So places like Best Buy were clearing them out for $10, just trying to get rid of these things. But I
Mm-hmm.
managed to
Yep.
right place, right time, seeing it there, grabbing it, and never looking back, because now it's like one of my favorite devices to have in my house, because the Vita is a great system, and I love being able to play those on the TV, and it also gives you an easy option if you want to stream the games and stuff. So yeah, like it's weird when some of those things happen. Like you don't know in hindsight with some of this stuff.
I used to work for Toys R Us years back, and I remember when the Vita got released, and we got the launch games, we got the systems, and we never got in any memory cards.
Yep.
And it was just like, how can they send us all of this and no memory cards for
Mhm.
the system? And then I kind of end up realizing that no one in the community and in my area didn't want a Vita at all
Yep.
and stuff. They magically disappeared, I think, during Christmas time because they put them on a lot of sales. But Sony wasn't restocking any Vitas and everything after its initial launch at our store. Don't know why.
That's pretty crazy to think about, but it's not surprising because like I was living in Thunder Bay, Ontario at the time when the Vita came out, which is like a smallish town up north, because I was going, I went back to college then. And
Hmm.
when the Vita came out, I remember going to all the different stores in town trying to find a Vita, and none of them even had it in stock. Like there was a GameStop there, didn't have the Vita. We had a Target there, didn't have the Vita. I went to Best Buy, didn't have the Vita. I had to go to the grocery store, the real Canadian Superstore, as it's called, which is basically like a big like chain of grocery stores. Turns
Hmm.
out they have an electronics section, and they had the Vita, and no one else in town had the Vita. So it was just the weirdest thing to think about. So I was like, yeah, thank God you had this, because I've been looking for it everywhere, because I couldn't, like, no one was taking pre-orders for it. So I was like, all right, I'll go day one to try and get this, because I was really excited for the Vita. I loved the PSP. And I thought there was some promise with the Vita, and yeah, so I actually had to go to the grocery store and pick up the Vita that way.
Wow.
And they had the memory cards. So I was able to walk home with the 32 gig memory card, thankfully, because I was going to buy most of the games digitally, because at the time I had the mindset where with portable games I didn't want to own a lot of the portable games physically, especially
Hmm.
the Vita ones in particular, because they're very tiny and easy to lose. So I
Yes.
didn't want to go down that route again, especially too because I was like I knew I was only going to stay in Thunder Bay probably for another 6 months after I got the Vita. So it's just like I'm just going to get the biggest storage card I can get, so I can download as much stuff as I can and kind of go as digital only as possible.
Now, I have to ask you, did you have a arcade like lifestyle also growing up as a kid? Like, did you play games in the arcade? And how is the gaming community in Canada? Um,
So
in
first
the
of all,
past compared to the present.
absolutely. So back in the day, you didn't see a lot of arcades here, or especially in the towns I personally was living in Canada. But actually, we lived in the States for a few years, because we used to live in Houston.
Oh,
And when I lived there were lots of places you could go play like arcade machines there. So we actually did that a ton while we were living in Houston. We actually would go and play Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. The arcade game was one of our favorites.
nice.
X-Men, Simpsons, like all those Konami beat 'em up games. Like you better believe we were playing
Uh-huh.
those. Fighting games, Street Fighter 2, Mortal Kombat. Like we played a ton of them. In fact, there was one day we went on a family trip to Universal Studios Hollywood, or not Hollywood, Universal Studios Florida, and
Yeah.
they have an arcade there, or at least they did back in the day. And they had a machine in there called for a game called Virtual On, which was a Sega mech game. But the way
Yes.
that they did, like, because Sega used to do this a bunch back in the day, but they had the arcade machine itself had like these giant controls on it to basically simulate the fact that you're in a mech while playing it. So like me and
Yes.
Kyle basically like played that game for like 3 hours straight, just popping endless quarters into it, despite the fact that we were at a theme park to go. We could have gone all these rides and stuff like that, but we were like, nope. We were just so much more, entranced by Virtual On, because we had never seen this arcade machine before. We were like, oh, we gotta just keep playing Virtual On all day, and eventually my dad had to come in and kind of rip us off those machines so we could go and do do other things, go see the Terminator 3D show, or go to, the Twister ride and stuff like that. So which is funny to think about. But yeah, no, we used to go to arcades all the time. But yeah, that arcade scene in Canada especially really died off pretty quickly. It's now starting to come back in a big way,
Mhm.
with barcades are kind of becoming a big thing here in
Yes.
Toronto, which is where I live. So there's lots of places in town where we'll do that. In fact, a lot of times when I meet up with other gaming press in Toronto, because there actually is a pretty big Toronto gaming press scene here, we will usually meet up at barcades to then, just talk about things amongst ourselves, but also to play arcade games, because you go in, you basically play a cover charge, and all the games are on free play, so you can play as many of them as you want.
Yes. We actually have a place called Galloping Ghost here. It's like an hour away. It's closer to Chicago, but it's
Mhm.
less an hour away from me. And you pay like, I think they may win up to $25, and you play all these arcades. They expanded, so you got all of these arcades from Japan, Brazil. That's games that never get released. That's where Primal Rage 2 is at.
Oh, nice.
So I got to try to get there because I was watching what happened, and the huge Matt Muscles was talking about Primal Rage 2, and I didn't know they was doing a sequel for
Yeah.
that game. Um, and then I looked. I remember when I seen it, I'm like, oh, this game did get. I'm like, it didn't hit me to be like, oh, they did announce it at EGM, but I never knew what happened to the game, and
Mhm.
so it ended up getting canceled and
Yeah, like
everything.
they never came out with a console version or anything like that. Like you see that a lot
Right.
with some of this stuff. Like there's also just, there are so many arcade games that are just lost to time at this point, because they someone would have to have invested in this large machine to put in their place, and they're not going to do that for every single game that comes out. Like there are so many arcade games that just also haven't gotten ports to modern consoles. I'm doing an episode of Pit Stop Retro Gaming next week, that's coming out next week, all about Alien video games. And there's multiple Alien arcade machines. In fact, they never did like a console game based off the movie Aliens back in the day. Like they did
Mhm.
Alien 3 on every console, like Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, and whatnot. But they never did Aliens, which is weird to me, because they had an Aliens arcade game, the arcade machine made by Konami, of all companies, that
Yep.
was in very few places, and there's no real modern way to play that without like doing crimes and getting your MAME emulator up and running at this point. Like there's no other way to play that game at this point. Like so it's kind of like there's a lot of games like that that are just lost to time, or there were a lot of canceled arcade machines, or arcade machines that came out very sporadically, but then they never got console re-releases because those console releases got canceled. Like Primal Rage 2, it's a perfect example
Yes.
of that. So
If you want to be a Patreon producer, head on over to Patreon, patreon.com/BossRushMedia, and find out which tier is right for you. Our Patreon producers at the $5 tier or higher for this month are Adriel Munger, Austin Campbell, Celeste Roberts, Christian S., Sana Dierig, Francisco Santillan, and Rebecca Jewell. Thank you for your continued support.
Like Tattoo Assassins, I never got to play or see that game. I remember it EGM, but I never got to play it or anything. I know it's not good,
yeah.
but I'm like, okay, I guess someone was able to finish this game and put it out by Data East. I'm like, that's crazy. That is literally crazy. I've been an arcade kid, and I think that's why I like the arcade archives that come out on
Yeah.
modern platforms, and pay $7.99 or $3.99 when they go on sale for games that I've never heard or seen.
Yeah.
I feel like it's a new experience to me as a
Yeah.
gamer. I don't know if you ever felt that way or anything.
Oh, I say that all the time. Even if it's old, if I've never played it before, it's new to me. So I treat it kind of like a new game. In fact, like again, with a lot of the research I do for Pit Stop Retro Gaming, I'm playing so many games I just never played growing up. So I love getting a chance to discover new games and experiences and things like that. So yes, absolutely. Like that. I in fact, like, if you listen to our content, a lot of times I talk about modern games, because that our shows are kind of tailored around modern content with a lot of stuff, like extra Xbox Drive as an example, but most of my time is, split kind of 50-50 between playing retro games and playing modern stuff. So I love to play the new stuff, but I also really like playing the old stuff too. So I like to have like a nice balance between those there. Cause half my week this week was, spent, playing Final Fantasy 14 and some other modern games, but it was also spent, pulling out my Xbox 360 and playing some old arcade games that, were ported to 360, but never came to other consoles, or, pulling out the NES and playing, Dragon Warrior and some other stuff. So yeah, I like to do a little bit of both.
Yeah, I feel like there's some modern retro games. You mentioned like the Xbox 60 and everything, and I think anything from the regular Xbox or PS2, I want to say GameCube now, in a sense, are modern retro games that people can go back and play.
Technically, by the definition of what's retro, I mean that's really anything more than 10 years old at this point, or 15 years old at this point, even. By that definition, Xbox 360 and PS3 are considered retro at this point, which is weird to think about. It's weird to think about that they are considered retro consoles, but yeah, it's been 10 years since like this year's the 10-year anniversary of PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. So like they're definitely getting up there in age. I mean, for God's sakes, Xbox 360 came out in 2005. That's 18 years ago at this point. We're almost at the 20-year anniversary of 360.
I chose PS3 over 360 when it came to modern game between those two systems. And I think it's definitely because of the Red Ring of Death and all the stories people was talking about. And Sony had this thing called Blu-ray and the cell processor. And I was just like, if I'm going to work all these crazy hours at my job, I think I feel like more confident in having a PlayStation 3 and everything. And I remember I got my PlayStation 3 and I got like Darksiders. I ended up getting what is the Sega and Platinum game that
Bayonetta? Vanquish?
No, Vanquish. Yeah. I need a sequel, Nintendo. Give them some money. Someone give Platinum some money so we could get that sequel, because I don't like the way how that game ended.
Well, that's one of those things where that game just didn't sell, so I don't know if that'll ever happen. Like even when they did the re-release of Vanquish on Xbox One, the 4K version, that one didn't sell either. So it's just like I don't know if that game ever comes back, which makes me sad because the game's really good.
It's so good. And I got two other. Infamous. I got nice. And everything. Infamous is so good. We were talking about on our podcast Jump Off Point, one of our co-hosts is just getting into PlayStation. So he started out with PlayStation 5. And I told him, I'm like, if anything, I told him Resistance 1 to 3 is a must play. But I told him, I'm like, Infamous 1 and 2 is required for you to play. You got to play Infamous 1 to understand why Infamous 2 is better.
Right. Exactly.
Because that third part of Infamous is torture. I'm like, this is too much Sucker Punch. Y'all threw in too much. I just want to finish this game. And everything.
When you eventually get the TV powers and stuff, you're like, I'm probably good. No, I actually liked Infamous Second Son. I think it was fine, but it was definitely not as. I didn't definitely like it as much as the first two. Like I think Infamous 1 and 2 are fantastic games. So,
yes,
yeah, they're some of my favorite PlayStation 3 games. Like that's when I was really, getting into PlayStation 3 because I was very much an Xbox 360 person. Despite the fact that I actually got both of them at both of their respective consoles at launch, but it was just the year head start that 360 had just really got me more ingrained in that ecosystem much faster than PS3, especially because I was a big dum-dum at the time, and I will openly say this. I went and sold my original Xbox collection to get my Xbox 360 at launch to the end, like 4 games and a bunch of accessories and stuff like that. Like I was all in on 360 at launch, especially because like at the time BioWare was my favorite video game company, and I loved Knights of the Republic and stuff. So when they announced Mass Effect was exclusive to Xbox for 360, I was like, I need to get a 360 as quickly as possible, even though it took 2 years after the console came out, before Mass Effect finally came out. But I was playing games like Oblivion or Peter Jackson's King Kong, the official game of the movie, or Ghost
Yeah.
Recon Advanced Warfighter. Like, I was playing so many games on Xbox 360 and just having a blast with it, that when the PS3 did eventually come out a year later, like, I got it at launch and was playing Heavenly Sword as an example. But I just wasn't like, I don't know, I just didn't use it nearly as much as my 360, especially because I did have more people who I knew in person who also got 360s at launch too. So we were playing, Call of Duty 2 every night, and other Ghost Recon and a bunch of other games. So but the PS3, when I eventually got it, it wasn't really until the deluge of games kind of had built up over time. Like, I eventually, I really started getting back into PS3 when Infamous came out. That was kind of my gateway back into it.
I went from PS3 to Xbox One. I got PS4 later. I didn't like the 360 controller. I tried to play Gears of War, and I'm like, this controller does not feel good. But when Xbox One came out, I was just like, Microsoft got it right. Even after all the craziness, when I played, because they had Rise of the Tomb Raider exclusive, and I'm like, oh, of course I have to. But then Ori and the Blind Forest dropped, and I'm like, yeah, I'm getting an Xbox One. Like, nice. And I have nothing against the PlayStation 4. I think it's a great console, but at the time it looked like a Kit Kat to me. A Kit Kat bar to me, and I'm just like, I don't like it the time.
And then you get the PlayStation 4 Pro, and it looks like the triple decker Oreo, essentially.
Yeah. But I eventually got PlayStation 4, my Xbox One, and of course I had the GameCube, I had the Wii, I had the Wii U. Of course, I host Nintendo Power Block, and I'm a big Nintendo fan. And I remember at that time during Xbox One, because we're going to get into the Xbox Drive and about the show. I remember about Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and the Wii U, that era. And we've been talking about it, and people just like, well, it was a failure, it didn't sell this, it didn't have the games. And I was telling people, I'm like, it was an era I felt like if a game didn't sell a certain amount on Microsoft and Sony's systems, a studio was going to get closed. And everything, and they was considered stuff like that as a failure. And it just felt like with the Wii U, even though people felt like this is Nintendo's Dreamcast, still to this very day, for a system that failed, more people are talking about Wii U and the games. Even though not knowing them on Switch, they're still talking about those games more than Xbox One and PlayStation 4.
Yeah. Which is weird to think about, but I also think they live a bit in the cultural zeitgeist a bit more because of their Switch ports. Mario Kart 8, Tokyo Mirage Sessions, Yoshi's Crafted World, things like that, like all got ported over. In fact, really the only one we're missing at this point is Xenoblade Chronicles X, and I don't know if that ever gets ported at this point to Switch.
Yeah.
But you're right. You're definitely right. Like, from that sense, but also, people talk about that way with the Dreamcast. Like so many more people talk about the Dreamcast versus a lot of other consoles that generation still. Cause like they're like, oh my God, the Dreamcast was the coolest thing ever. Despite the fact that, there were only a handful of games that I still think are kind of worth playing at this point on Dreamcast. Cause there was a lot of games on there that just were okay, or definitely not the games you'd want to go back to today. Because I like my Dreamcast, I like having it, but it's like I also know the reality where it's just like, it was kind of an in between time where people were still learning how to make 3D games just in general, and there's a lot of really bad 3D games on the Dreamcast to go back to. But there, it's got some really good games like Skies of Arcadia or NFL 2K1, things like that. But there's also a lot of stuff that's not good on that console.
But Soul Calibur and Street Fighter 3 Third Strike was my top tier Dreamcast games.
Yeah, and got to throw in Marvel vs. Capcom 2 in there as well. Like, that's
what? I keep forgetting about that game.
Yeah,
that it came to Dreamcast, because I kept seeing it in arcades so much that I forgot that Capcom did a port for the Dreamcast.
Well, it came to Dreamcast first. Well, it came to arcades first, then Dreamcast, then it came to PlayStation 2 and Xbox.
Yeah, and I remember the PlayStation 2 and Xbox version, but not the Dreamcast, and I do not know why.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that's the one that people actually prefer if they want to go back and play Marvel vs. Capcom now. It's just like people are like, oh, we got to bust out the Dreamcast to play Marvel vs. Capcom on it because it's got that VGA output on the back of it, so it makes it look, kind of fancy. Even though I actually think the original Xbox version actually is a bit better, but it's a lot closer to the arcade version, I think.
It did Jet Set Radio. It's a classic on that system. Yeah. So Xbox Drive. Mm-hmm. The Carpool Gaming Xbox podcast. How did that show come about? And can you give a lot of people an understanding on what the show's about?
Absolutely. So first off, I will say I haven't been there from the beginning because Xbox Drive has been around since 20. I'm trying to think back. I think 2016, 2017 is when Sean started it. He started it with Dave Moore, who was the first co-host. Dave Moore, now host of the Snack Network, which is a YouTube channel focused entirely on snacks, trying different snacks and then reviewing snacks. But Dave didn't. The funny thing was Dave didn't play Xbox at all. But Sean needed someone to like kind of host the show for him. So Dave was like, this will be fun. And they kind of just didn't really, the beauty of the original Xbox Drive is they barely talked about Xbox. It was mostly, talking about their day or because the way that the Xbox Drive was, set up, it was the reason it's called Xbox Drive is it was a podcast in a car that Sean, at the time was working so much at his job that he couldn't, record a podcast at his house. So the only time he had in his day to record a podcast was in his car on his way to work. So Dave would be like on a Skype call with him and they would, talk about Xbox or snacks or going through the McDonald's drive-through, which is used to be our mainstay of our show. Sean's trip to McDonald's halfway through the podcast and ordering coffee and then, continuing the podcast from there. But then, after about 50 episodes, Dave decided to kind of do his own thing. So Sean brought in Luke Lore, of course, now host of Xbox Expansion Pass. Of course, Luke has been absolutely killing it over there. Y'all, if you're not listening to Xbox Expansion Pass, go listen to it. Luke does some amazing interviews over there. So Sean and Luke did the Xbox Drive together for about 50 episodes as well. And the show very much went back on track, mostly talking about Xbox, still retaining the idea of Sean in the car, on his way to work with Luke telling him all the stories about Xbox that week. And Luke had to leave the show as well. A few years later, back in 2019. And that's when I jumped in. Was that around when Gears 5 came out is when I joined the Xbox Drive. I was doing my own podcast.
We had to stop real quick.
Okay.
Gears 5 is the best game out of the whole series. That game is, it's gorgeous on Series X, but I think it's the best, probably the most cohesive game in the series. Gears 5 is beautiful from the moment you press start. Mm-hmm. I love Gears 5.
Yeah, same. I actually love that game as well. Like I don't know. I have a soft spot for Gears of War 1, but I feel like it's just harder to go back to that game now, even if you play the Ultimate Edition versus playing something like Gears 5. So I do think Gears 5 is probably the better game. But in my heart of hearts, I feel like I like the first one probably more personally. But I actually think like Gears 5 is a very solid choice. I think it's definitely like my personal second favorite game. So, and I can definitely see why you'd pick it as your favorite for sure. But anyways, getting back to things like that. So I came on 2019 is when I joined the Xbox Drive. I had been doing podcasting since 2014 on a podcast called the Game Moose podcast, which was a very Canadian gaming podcast. We were just kind of like a general show where we'd spend like 3 hours talking about whatever in the world of games every single week. And that's kind of how Sean, discovered me for the show, was because he used to listen to Game Moose and would write in all the time. We even did like a crossover episode where we actually like mashed our intros together and stuff like that to do, Xbox Drive cross Game Moose. So that was a whole thing that we did. So that's how I got, my start on Xbox Drive, and very similar from there. Like we've kind of kept the show alive from, 2019 to present day at this point. We're not currently in the car at this point because Sean, we kind of stopped that during the pandemic because Sean wasn't going to work. So like, there's no sense in him just driving around in a circle while we record this podcast together. It just didn't make, logical sense or economical sense. So we did just do the show like a normal, like we're doing the show now, like we're over a spike call, but we're doing the show every single Wednesday. We've been doing it pretty much ever since I joined the show without any breaks, and it's been a lot of fun. So Xbox Drive, of course, you can find us every Wednesday over on the Carpool Gaming YouTube channel. We are live. We like to keep the show under an hour because we want to keep it nice and tight for people's commute, so you can have like listen to an entire show on your way to doing whatever that is that you're doing, and then kind of going about your day from there. And we talk all things Xbox on the show.
Yes, I know one of your biggest shows that's going to be coming up is definitely the the Microsoft presentation.
Yeah.
I believe June 11th is going to be the showcase. Everybody's watching it. I'm trying to get off of work that day so I can watch it, or come in later, because I'm excited to see what Microsoft has, and I could honestly say, uh, me and my friend Corey, we are co-founders of Boss Rush with my friend Jesse Douglas, and when E3 was going on, we will all watch the Microsoft conference and talk about it. And my friend Jesse, he's big into Xbox. That's like he's the fan favorite of it. Um, and we always felt like Microsoft, you know, from I would say their leading position. Some people say they have fell from grace, but I don't feel it that way. I think their business idea has changed on how they go about games
Yeah.
and stuff. We feel that Microsoft is still important to the gaming industry and to the culture and things, and so when we see their presentations, we get hyped like anything else because I screamed when I found out Microsoft brought Ninja Theory. I'm like, wait, what? It did just seem that Microsoft, how important they are for gaming. I think a lot of people don't realize that when they're listening to an Xbox podcast, they got to keep in mind that regardless of what Xbox does, they're going to come out being fine,
Mm-hmm.
in a sense.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
financially, Microsoft isn't really losing money. In fact, if you look at, all of the reports, like Xbox is one of the divisions at Microsoft that makes the most money at this point. So, I mean, they
yeah,
are, I mean, it's just one of those things where, when you compare them to PlayStation, that's where you have that feeling or sentiment that they've fallen from grace, because obviously they're not selling as many
it,
units or consoles as PlayStation, but Xbox also has different metrics than PlayStation. They're not after this, they're not going for the same game as Sony is. So
yeah,
you have to really look at it from a different lens when examining Microsoft. Again, they're still, they wouldn't be continuing to do Xbox if it wasn't profitable, or if they didn't see a reason to do it. So yes, absolutely. I think Microsoft, I agree with your point that they definitely serve a purpose in this industry, and the industry is definitely better for them being here. I mean, if they were to suddenly disappear one day, I mean, and you just had Sony and Nintendo, I mean, it would be really, really strange times ahead,
it,
especially with PlayStation, having full control over that, high end market at that point. Then, unless another contender kind of emerged at that point,
mhm.
PlayStation would be free to raise prices or do all kinds of other crazy stuff, which you don't want to see them, like companies like that, do. Or same with Nintendo. So I mean, that I think they're important to kind of balance things out in the game industry. And I like how, again, all three companies are kind of trying to do different things. Microsoft and Sony are definitely the most similar between the three of them, but they're not
Yeah,
all. But they're also not trying to, like, they don't have the same game plan. Like Microsoft is more about subscription numbers and keeping people engaged in their ecosystem, whether it is on PC
mhm.
or on Xbox. Versus Sony is just like, we just want you to buy PlayStations and buy games on PlayStation. That's it. So the mindsets are very
and,
different.
and a lot of people got to realize that PlayStation was keeping Sony afloat.
Mhm,
If PlayStation had failed, Sony would be in big trouble at this time.
mhm,
Why you think that during their PlayStation 3 era and PlayStation 4 era, a lot of when it came to Sony themselves, PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 3 were being highlighted because they was keeping they stopped doing computers. They
yeah.
weren't doing a lot of audio stuff. and everything, and TVs. And if there was a TV, it was always connected to PlayStation.
Yeah.
So people got to remember, like, if you think a company is failing, they're not.
Yeah.
Like I told people during the Nintendo era, the Wii U era, like Nintendo is fine. They're not failing, but they got no systems. Them must got 10 billion yen saved up
Mhm.
in their bank account. They said if they go over under, they are going to start all over again.
Yeah.
Nintendo is smart. They know how to make their money.
Mhm.
So yeah,
Yeah.
but I agree with you that all of them are doing, I think, great. They're delivering great games and stuff. And I gotta ask you, Ryan, how do you see the future of Xbox um at this time, like going forward? Like, do you see them, even if they did acquire Activision Blizzard,
Mhm.
how do you see them in the future, and what do you think that does for you and Sha as content creators for Xbox Drive?
Yeah, I think it really just in the future, I just see them doubling down more on Game Pass. I mean, that's a given. And trying
Hmm.
to make it the main way that people play games on their console, because I still think there's a lot of people in the Xbox ecosystem that either don't have Game Pass or have it, but don't really use it as like their primary way of playing games. See, there you go. So I feel like there's
And
uh
I got, like I say, I gotta clarify. I don't do Game Pass because I buy my games
yeah.
physically and digitally for
But you know
Xbox.
what?
That's
I'm kind of in the same boat with a lot of stuff. Like the only things that I don't really buy on Xbox are Microsoft first party games. So, whenever Halo comes out or whenever, Psychonauts came out and things like that, like I would play those games on Game Pass. I mean,
I
luckily we've been able to, because we have a close relationship with Xbox Canada here in Canada. So we have a lot of times we usually get able to get those games a bit early. But either way, if I was a normal consumer, I would just be playing those on Game Pass. Like that would be the reason to have my Game Pass
see,
subscription because other
and,
like third
and
party games, I'm
I
usually
full
buying
on
them.
buy first. Yeah, I full on buy first party
Okay.
for 'em. So I do have my first party Halo Infinite and Forza 5 and Hellblade. They didn't do physical; it's
Yeah.
all digital. But like their first party stuff, I went out and bought Redfall. I'm doing
Mhm.
the review. I got to put the review out for it. So by the time people see this, it'll be out. But I went out and bought Redfall on a disc.
Mhm.
Uh,
That's kind of
and
crazy to think about, but no, but that's the thing. There, I know you're not the only person with that mindset, even on Xbox. There's lots of people out there that are still not, that still haven't adopted. So I think the years to come for Xbox, at least the next 10-year mission for them, is to try and get as many people like you or I who are not like Game Pass primary people to
uh-huh.
engage with Game Pass more, because then that opens the door for them to bring more content into Game Pass, which then brings them a consistent dollar revenue stream just from people subscribing to Game Pass and keeping them in that ecosystem. Because likewise, studies show that if you're paying for a service like Game Pass and you're using it regularly, you're less likely to go out and buy games on PlayStation or go out and buy games on Nintendo or on PC. Like you're gonna stay in that. You're more likely to stay in that Microsoft ecosystem at that point. It's one of the reasons why, even though there's a ton of subscription services out there for movies, most people have a Netflix subscription and nothing else because people are so ingrained in the Netflix ecosystem. And I think that's
Hmm.
kind of the direction Microsoft is kind of going in, which just makes it really interesting for us as content creators. Even though we have like sometimes we have a string of bad news for Xbox, like Redfall reviews or thing like them like having the Activision Blizzard deal being blocked and stuff like that. But I also think there's going to be lots of interesting things to cover in the world of Xbox over the years to come, especially just seeing the way that they're evolving the console and evolving their mindset when it comes to putting out games. So I still think there's a lot of interesting things for us to look forward to in the future. And especially I'm just interested to see how they're going to handle even just the Black Activision Blizzard deal when it does eventually go through, with the concessions that I'm assuming, they're going to have to, apply to the deal whenever the FTC, for example, weighs in on it sometime in the next 2 months. So yeah, like whether or not some of those end up on Game Pass, or what company do they try and acquire next, or do they take some extra money and maybe put it into their studios? Like I think there's some fascinating stuff there to cover over the years.
Yeah, I don't. Hmm. it's going to be very. I feel like this deal is not going to end until next year.
Yeah.
I think it'll be finalized next year, and then we'll see whatever they decide to do with it.
Yeah, I
Because
think it really just comes down to what the FTC has to say, one way or the other. Because if it's like the EU system verdict, where they basically are like, here are the concessions, and Microsoft agreed to them. If it's something like that, then I actually think it will probably be sooner than that. But if it's more complicated than that, then you're probably right. It's probably a next year thing.
yes. Well, before I let you go, Ryan, I gotta know two questions. I definitely have to ask you. I'm sorry. The
Okay.
first question: what is with the pricing in Canada?
So
Like,
it seems more expensive, but when you actually do the conversion between Canadian and American dollars, the price is actually the same. It seems more because, like, when you have a $70 game in the States, it's
mhm,
$89.99 Canadian. But when you do the conversion from US to Canadian dollars, they round up maybe by a couple cents, but it's basically the same price. However, we actually did a podcast pretty recently on Xbox Drive, me and Bobby Politis from Console Creatures, about Canadian game prices, because we're starting to see a $98 price point for games starting to creep in a little bit, because they never make it, like, companies never make a big announcement about Canadian pricing. They'll just update it
yeah,
sometimes like that. Like, we actually saw that when games went to $79.99 over $69.99. Like when Metal Gear Solid 5 came out, that's when that was happening for us. So even though, and that actually makes it so we're paying $5 or $10 more than what the US price is for games at that point, when you do the conversion. So I think, like, as long as the dollars amount that we have currently for games stays at $79.99 and $89.99, we're actually basically paying the same price as you. It's more money in theory, because when you do the conversion. But we're not really paying anything more or anything like that. But it just looks like it is more. But if that $98 price creeps in, then we'll actually be paying more for games in Canada than you guys pay there.
because I was looking at Shaw. He made a statement about it like way a couple of months ago about pricing and stuff, and I'm just like, okay, that seems way high compared to what we're paying. What is going
The
on with the
crazy
price?
thing too is that here where I live in Ontario, because all the provinces have different taxing, it's 15% on anything I buy is tax. So an $89.99 game is
It's
over $100 after tax,
why is it so much?
because that's just the provincial tax. Whereas where Sean lives, out in Alberta, I think it's only like 4 or 5% tax on everything. So it's much cheaper, because it's all done by each individual province itself. It's almost like if every state in the United States had a different tax that they tax on every
Yes,
product that you buy.
which we do.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, it's not
actually, yeah,
they
we
do,
do.
but it's not as drastic as it is in Canada, where
Right.
like a 11% increase over what I pay on every product, everything I buy, versus what Sean pays is kind of drastic, despite the fact that we live in the same country.
Does those taxes go to certain things
Yeah.
like
So
schools, roads,
the idea
hospitals?
is that the basically there's 3% of that tax is for the federal government, and they decide how to divvy that out, whether it is for roads or education or whatever, and
Mhm.
then the rest of that comes for the province that you live in. So again, Ontario charges, I think it's like 12% or something for just the Ontario tax, for, again, maintaining Ontario, because it is Ontario by far is the biggest province population wise out of all of Canada. So
Yeah.
it's the one that requires the most infrastructure. So when you think about it in that way, it
Oh,
makes sense
okay.
that they would charge the most tax, because we're kind of like, when you compare, United States to each other, like, we're kind of like New York State or California as far as population is concerned when you compare it to the rest of the country. Whereas, Alberta, where Sean lives, is much more comparable to something like North Dakota or Montana in population.
Okay. Okay. That solves that. That's a big relief. And for my final question, because you are in Canada, what is your favorite snack and what is your favorite cereal if you still eat
Oh,
cereal?
Oh man, those are some good questions. So I should preface that I don't really eat, sweet things. I'm not a sweet person, so I don't like, cookies and crackers and candy and stuff like that. So I don't really have a lot to say about Canadian, chocolate bars and things like that, or Canadian sugary snacks. I mean, my favorite
Mhm.
snack is popcorn. I love popcorn. It's my
That
favorite thing.
works.
Yeah. So I love, smart food, of course, like white cheddar
Oh, so
popcorn
good.
or,
Okay, see that's
or
the
Reckenbach
that
stuff.
that one and the caramel smart pop is really good. I
See,
like.
that's the thing. I've never been into caramel corn. Even when I was a kid and I ate sweet things, I
Oh
never was
really?
really into caramel corn. But it was also just like because I didn't really love the crunchiness with the caramel. It just I don't know. It's just, for me. I've never been into it. But I know again, no disrespect to anyone that's into caramel
Okay.
corn or anything like that. Um, so, and I'm trying to remember the other question you had. So favorite snack, I'd say popcorn, smart food, stuff like
Popcorn
that.
and the cereal. Favorite kind of
Cereal.
cereal.
Cereal again, since I'm not like a super sweet tooth, I do actually like apple cinnamon Cheerios a lot. That's kind of my go-to. So
Yes.
yeah, when it comes to
Ah,
cereal, but yeah, because like cereal is also one of the things where it's like if I want like a late night snack, because I also versus a lot of other people, I actually work late evenings so at my job,
mhm.
so I'm the type of person that that even though I have a normal job, like a normal 5 day a week job, I'm staying up until 5 in the morning every night because of my work schedule. So and a lot of times, I don't want to, bust out popcorn at 2 in the morning. So, that's usually cereal time for me.
And do you have? I'm sorry to add this on.
That's fine.
Do you have a gaming meal when there's a new release? Sometimes, like when okay, so for me, when Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity came out,
Mhm.
uh I did a red theme of getting like red Bear's pizza,
Oh yeah.
um a red Mountain Dew, and and I'll have my game. So when I got home, I cooked my pizza, I had my drink, and I had my game and everything. And I just had that snack or that meal while gaming. Do you sometimes have that, or do you even snack while gaming sometimes?
Yeah, I tend not to because I don't want to get stuff on my controllers. Is It's kind of like a
Hmm.
nitpick for me. Um, but I will say, like, if like Diablo 4 is a perfect example because Diablo 4 at the time of recording this coming out next week for early access, and I'm already planning on basically spending 12 hours that day playing it. I have the day off from work. I'm going to be probably on stream the entire day. So I mean, I'm going to be definitely, that's a pizza day for me. That's very, very much like my go-to meal whenever a new game is releasing and I'm just going to be playing it all day. It's pizza all the way. That's kind of my thing because it's quick and easy and you can get into it. And pizza is very good. It's one of my favorite meals. So I love just getting a nice pizza and getting like a I don't know, just a bottle of water or something
How,
that they go with it. Again,
how
I'm
do you
very
like your
boring when it comes to
crust?
food stuff. So
How do you like your crust? Thin crust, thick crust stuff? Like,
See, it always depends on where you get your pizza from. I think more than anything because
ooh,
different places have different, mindsets on what thin versus
yes.
thick crust is. Because, like, for the most part, I mostly do thin crust because I like the crust, but I also don't like a ton of it. Because I know a lot of Canadian pizza places go overboard with the crust, like in a way that when I lived in the
Really?
States and went to a lot of American pizza places don't do. So, and I know that I don't want, like, if you go to, national chain pizza, which is like one of the biggest chain pizza places here in Canada. If you
Uh,
get their thick cut crust pizza or even just their normal crust pizza, it's way too much crust. It's like half the pizza's crust at that point. So
oh no.
I'm like, I like crust enough, but I don't like that much crust. I like the rest of the pizza. So at that point, like if I had pizza there, it would be thin crust. So, and I know a lot of other Canadian places are kind of like that, which is just a weird thing in Canada that a lot of places, even when you get like Canadian Domino's, it can sometimes be like that. So you have to be, yeah, you kind of have to. I think for us here in Canada, I think it really just depends on the place more than anything.
Awesome. Well, because what is it? Tim Nortis, I think, is the big coffee in
Tim Hortons, yeah,
Canada.
yeah,
Is it Tim Nortis? Okay, a thing I still want to try so bad. Everybody says it's so good, but I don't
yeah.
know.
It's
I,
all
I'm a
right.
I'm a I'm a Dunkin' kid, so
Yeah.
I love my Dunkin'
Okay.
Donuts.
then you'll probably like it then, because it's very Dunkin-esque. So if you like Dunkin' Donuts coffee, you'll probably actually like Tim Hortons. And you don't even have to, the nice thing about Tim Hortons, you don't even have to come to Canada to get it. You just have to go to, New York City or some other American cities. They have Tim Hortons in a bunch of American cities now. But yeah, it's just not as plentiful as, Dunkin's and whatnot. But it's definitely doable. You don't even have to come all the way here to do that, which is nice. It's like some of our restaurants have bled over like that. Like Swish LA is kind of, which is like a rotisserie chicken place, kind of like Boston Market. It's kind of bled over in that way too.
I've been to Toronto. In high school, we ended up going to sing at different churches and at a certain mall. I think Sega used to have an arcade place there. I think it was like Sega World or something.
Maybe. I mean, it's not there now. So, but I remember going there because I haven't lived in Toronto my entire life. I've only really lived here for about 10 years now.
Okay.
But, which is still a long time. Because I moved here when the PlayStation 4 was coming out. So that's one of the things I always remember is because I remember getting my first year here, the PlayStation 4 came out. So I remember getting it in the mail here, but no. So I've kind of moved all over the place in my lifetime. But mostly still in Canada, but just kind of like in smaller parts of Canada. So yeah, Toronto is one of those things where it's just like, I don't know a lot of older Toronto that just like things in Toronto, like the Sega Arcade, if that was ever a thing. Like
I think that was it. Yeah, the Sega Arcade. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Ryan, thank you so much for this 1v1. I know we didn't talk about the RPG crew. Is that still going on?
Yeah, absolutely. The RPG Cave happening every Monday night, except for currently where the schedule's kind of in flux because Garrett, my co-host, Garrett Bland, is actually currently in China on vacation for a month. So we're having guest hosts on the show for the next month. So the scheduling is kind of all over the place. We're doing the show on Sunday, for example, this week. But it's still happening every single week. And then of course, my new show, Pitch Stop Retro Gaming, it's just me doing that show. No one else. That happens once a month at the end of the month. So May 30th is our next episode of that. All about alien video games is what this month's episode is all about, which is exciting. I'm excited for people to say that episode's going to be good. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on the show today, man. I really appreciate it. This was a ton of fun. Of course, if you want to see all of our content, it's just right on YouTube, youtube.com/Carpool Gaming, as well as we're on all the podcast feeds for all of our podcasts as well.
And if people want to find you and follow you, where can they find you at?
Well, you could pull out your Tiger Electronics handheld console, the game.com.
I can't with you.
Open up the web browser app, and then in the web browser app, you tap on the address bar, okay? And then you type in http://www.twitter.com/RyanTurford is where you find me. And also you can find us on Twitter at Carpool Gaming on Twitter as well.
Yes, guys, do follow their Discord. And I believe you guys also have a Patreon too, correct?
Patreon.com/Carpool Gaming, as well as our Discord. It's free to join. We have over 1,000 people in the Discord now, which is kind of crazy to think about. So you can definitely come over and hang out with us and talk about games. We talk about all kinds of cool stuff in the Carpool Gaming Discord. Again, if you want the link for that, that's on our website, actually, carpoolgaming.com. Has that there, or if you watch any of our videos or listen to our podcast, it's always in the description there as well if you want to join up.
Yes. Well, thank you, Ryan, for this 1v1. Everybody, have a great week, have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time on 1v1. Bye, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
1v1, the creator interview series, is a product of Boss Rush Media, LLC, and part of the Boss Rush Podcast Supplemental Podcast. This show is hosted by Celeste Roberts. You can also hear interviews from other Boss Rush Media members on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at FairyCrypt. To get updates on the latest episodes, follow the Boss Rush Podcast, Boss Rush Media, and Boss Rush Network on all major social media platforms, or subscribe to the Boss Rush podcast feed in your favorite podcast application. Join the Boss Rush Network Discord and Facebook groups to interact with other friends and fans. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.